for inviting me. It's a real joy again to share some music with you this afternoon. Yeah, the esoteric principles of sound in music rather than the sound of music, which Lawrence suggested yesterday. Why don't we change the subject? It's such a lovely musical. Of course you know it. But what I would like to share this afternoon is how composers like Beethoven and Scriabin, how they really developed their musical language throughout their lives, and how this corresponds with their evolution of consciousness. I also would like to say, a co-worker in New York, Michael, summed it up very beautifully. He said, listening leads to a revelation in many ways and on many different levels. I could just say this and then play, actually. But because I think as a music therapist, we have the real privilege to delve quite deep into the musical substance and see what happens in the interactions between human beings, engaging in music, in creating a musical language to support development. In mental health, it's about often tackling very severe crises that people are in and finding a way through music to create a shared language is a huge unleashing of the power of music in improvisation. And I'm finding doing this work and going back to the great composers, being just blown away by what they've done, the musical structures they created. So it's in a way what I'm talking about is the interface and learning, a mutual exchange between the work I do as a music therapist and also as a pianist, continuing studying the great works. Firstly, just a brief introduction, because I want to make it quite, some of it a bit interactive, but also illustrating on the piano by playing extracts of what's happening in the music. But just to give a bit of context, we're all familiar with music, the musical ingredients, if you like. We have rhythm, we have melody, we have harmony. Rhythm we are very familiar with, of course, as human beings. We have a heartbeat, we breathe, we walk. I'm walking up and down like this, so I've got a rhythm going on here. And we have scales and melodic structures, the weaving together of pitch that creates musical forms. And we have the vertical dimension of harmonies, or harmonic structures. And of course, in Western music, we are very familiar, and we grow into a particular language, which we call the diatonic music, which is based on the triad. So here we have an interplay of rhythm, da da dee da dum bum bum, da 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 dum, and we have a melody. And underneath we harmonize. Let's take a famous nursery rhyme. So we have the interplay between rhythm, melodic structures, and harmony. So we grow into this as human beings. So our mothers usually, and fathers as well, when we interact with our young children, babies, there's an exchange of rhythm. Actually, even psychological developmentalists say this is music, it's intensity, it's pitch, it's rhythm. And you see the dance when mother infants and father infants interact. By the way, Laurie, I was quite disappointed to hear from the Russian experiment. The poor old rabbits, you know, the mom's brain lit up and not the father. So I was thinking to myself, I hope as human fathers we are a bit more evolved. But anyway, so this is the stuff of early interaction which creates our sense of identity, sense of self, psychologically speaking. And it's the exchange of pitch, rhythm, and we see that. There have been video analysis of this, when you see the baby does a movement like that, and the mother or father does woo, woo. And you have this synchronization, you have a building of a field of resonance that allows the baby, the child, to form a relationship to the environment. So this unfolds throughout the years, and we grow into a musical culture. So from the nursery rhymes, the lullabies, we receive, we're exposed to, we are internalizing a lot of different kinds of music. And music can mean so many different things. It can evoke strong sense of identity as well. I mean, if I play or take another identity, which is actually taken from Beethoven. And not to become too political, but we know what happens between these two melodies at the moment. They're trying to find some sort of resonance, but the melodies, the musical structure immediately instill a sense of identity, which is beautiful, because in the God Save the Queen we have the British identity. In the anthem for the European Union we have a broader sense of identity. So musically speaking, we look at all these different levels, and also when we grow as we grow up through different stages in our development, so maybe people who were teenagers in the 60s, so when we hear this song, we often have memories that we associate. And it gives us a sense of emotional connection, often strong emotional experiences. And what happens when we grow into adulthood, we stabilize, if you like, a sense of identity in our lives. In music therapy, we work a lot with this. In music therapy, we look at both the non-verbal elements of co-creation of music through pitch, rhythm, harmonics, setting up fields of resonance through interaction. And we work, if you like, at the personality level to help people to grow, to develop, often to go back to early developmental levels, to grow. If something went very, very into a state of disarray, if you like, in early development, through music therapy, sometimes we can go back to that place and revisit those places musically. So, this is what music therapy does, and it's really up. I've got a laser here as well. That's exciting. So we work here in the physical, etheric, astral, emotional, and lower mental level, where we create identity and orientation in social and cultural contexts and the ecology that we move in. And that's why also music evokes a very strong emotional response from us as human beings, because we grow through the initial emotional maturation where then, in terms of the brain development, the limbic system and beginning to regulate emotions, and then the mind and thinking unfolds. And we can look at how that is related to particular musical parameters. So now, moving on to that middle section where Beethoven and Scriabin sit. So what I would like to show is how Beethoven and Scriabin really move their language beyond the personal. I think, Christine, you mentioned yesterday the relationship between father and mother and the feminine aspect. And I mean, Scriabin is a great component of embodying also the feminine aspect in the music and developing it from a very emotionally highly sensitive language to a very new place. More on the second ray, Beethoven has a lot of first ray energy. He does it in a different way. But what they're doing, they're basically moving from the common shared, if you like, shared sense of understanding of musical language and reality, they move it towards a more impersonal place where the soul lives. It's also a more fiery place. It's also a more challenging place, musically speaking, often. That's also why mostly what I would play today would not necessarily use these sorts of things in music therapy, because they're quite powerful energies are associated with this music. So it also relates to the science of the Antakarana. I won't go into that too much, but it's what they've done also collectively and in music, and they're not the only ones, by the way, but they're two very, very important examples. They consciously bridge the personal experience, the emotional, cultural experience of music towards a spiritual level. So it's about the expansions of consciousness and the evolution of music of Beethoven and Scriabin. Here he is, Master Beethoven. And he's, of course, what's very significant and interesting is that his music developed in parallel to also deterioration of his hearing. So if you think about listening and hearing, and in English we have the wonderful distinction between listening and hearing, his hearing deteriorated to deafness. So the piece that I will focus on a bit of Beethoven, he was completely deaf by that time. But he developed a sense of listening, a capacity to listen and tune into different inner worlds, musical worlds that are unheard of at that time, and we could even say today. You know, they stretch our sense of experience, sense of musical experience. So I won't go too much into biographies and background of these composers, rather focus on musical extracts. So I'd like to play at the beginning of a piece of the early young Beethoven in his 20s. It's actually the first sonata, that is, opus 2. And just think back about the here we've got the scale. What I would like to say also, just as a listening guide throughout, we can consider musical tones as forces, energies, and where they sit, for example, on a diatonic scale, they have different energy levels. And for example, if I play you so you can hear how the beat is attractive too. So it's a resolution, when we say music, the resolution of the tonic to the dominant. But you see these forces, and there's this funny story about Mozart's dad. I think he used to play to get Mozart out of bed. And then he would leave it, and Mozart had to run downstairs and resolve it. So it shows the magnetic forces between the tones, and depending on the system that we use, these forces will be different. And what Beethoven and Scriabin will do, they delve into these forces, and this is really the esoteric science of music, where they begin to recreate the musical language, to alter our experience, and shift our perception to a different level of consciousness. Let me play the beginning of this sonata now. So we have, we know where home is, I think. If we listen to this, we know where home is. We have a sense of, question mark here, but etc. So we can, usually when we are familiar with classical music, we think about the time when Beethoven lived, and I'm talking about Mozart. We really, we are in a familiar language, inherited, and very much in tune also with Haydn's language, so the early classical language. And in the slow movements as well, it's a beautiful second movement. So again, we feel we can relax into this music. We have a sense of orientation. So now we do a fast zooming through 32 sonatas, 2 volumes like this, and go to the late period. And of course, there's a huge process with different stages in Beethoven's music. So I'm making a huge leap to his very last sonata. Sonata, opus 111, composed in 1821. If you look at the literature and even the music critics, it's quite fascinating. Even in the completely mainstream musicology, and Becker, for example, a music critic of the 19th century, says, there's a continuous striving to the heights, like a silver thread woven between earth and heaven. Or the other two, it's a visionary aura that had never been known in music before. And the magic alternation of darkness and ethereal lightness. So I would like to put this sonata as well in the context of the keynote, because actually when I read the keynote, one of the first thoughts musically I had, opus 111 by Beethoven. The army of the voice and moving within the sound. I would like to just play the very beginning of this. Remember them? Yeah. And I give a bit of a warning. This is a bit like Lawrence's plasma flame yesterday. That was just if people are sensitive with their hearing. So this sonata by Beethoven starts like this. Opening chord where on earth are we? No, not on earth. Musically speaking, if you orient ourselves around, where is home, we do not know at this stage where home is. So he plunges the listener into a state of uncertainty, we could say crisis. What he does is beginning to break down musical forms that we've been very accustomed to. And if you like, it's beginning to break down thought forms, habitual thought forms, and unleashes a very, in this instance, a very fiery energy. So we have themes in this movement, and I did associate this with the army of the voice, the wails of Maya, the conflicting forces within the realm where we are in immersed in matter. And we have sequences also, there's a strong sense also of, what I feel with late Beethoven, a real sense of knowing about suffering, but not getting lost in there. So he does sequences like these notes here. A creative fire is unleashed here, where Beethoven, in his unique way, mobilizes a will, and also a will to love, and he's the absolute determination to work through this lies in the music. And that's, again, as a music therapist, this is amazing what he's mobilizing. Working a lot with people who are experiencing psychosis, to mobilize a structure to help to begin to awaken a sense of structure and not getting lost in the turmoil. I mean, not that we would use this sonata, but the learning from this is wonderful. I'm going to play you a bit of this storm, and then moving, so from the army of the voice, to what Beethoven does in the second movement. The sonata has only 2 movements, so he puts up these 2 places musically. There's a drive and unleashing of fire and the battle between different forces. So he works through, and really there's an insight as well of forming and structuring and creatively working with these very strong forces that are unleashed by this initial musical crisis. What he does now, moving to the second movement, which is the arietta, where it's beginning to transcend the form and is moving to a very, very different place. So the end of this first movement is like this. it's the first part of this arietta, a very different place. There's a sense of simplicity, stillness, and also a clear sense of form. So now, rather than going out there now into the realm of matter and conflict, having gone through that journey, he's now turning inward. There's a strong sense of listening inward through this musical structure. And he's building variations on this theme. And in the very first, and won't play you all of it, it's a half-an-hour sonata, so I really apologize to Beethoven as well, just chopping up the whole piece. But I'm just giving you a bit of moments within the piece to listen in, and so you can listen to it in your own time. But what he does now, so he has to form this beautiful, simple arietta. The first variation does this. It's beginning to loosen up the structure. There's a sense of, oh, the ground is shifting a bit. Can you hear the passing notes? It's beginning to fluidify, open the musical structure. So this is what he does throughout the movement. And what happens within this musical structure is beginning also to increase the frequency. So it's beginning to dissolve the structure. I was thinking about also yesterday we had a lot on electricity and some reference to physics and Einstein's quote, and matter is energy. I mean, this is what we know. There's this statement from Einstein, of course, and the electrical implications of that. I'm not a scientist, but I was amazed by what Lawrence said yesterday. But he does something musically. He's beginning to turn this form into pure energy. And I will want to move on to Scriabin as well, but I want to give you a sense what he does musically to turn this form into energy. Further on in this movement, he's doing this. Can you still hear in the background the just have hints of the melody. And then it's beginning to introduce trills, so the function of the trills, which is a high vibration musical structure. lot of musical transformations here, and in a way this is the heart of the movement. And now he's beginning again to... This sound is beginning to dissolve and really find a point, actually moving in the direction of a point of complete stillness and silence by increasing the tension subtly and gradually. And we talked about this morning, how you see it like a propeller, to use a metaphor, an image. When it goes fast enough, it looks like a disc. It's beginning to do this, but interestingly, the perception of musical is that the form is beginning to dissolve into energy. So in these very last stages, we have a lot of trills in the upper register of the piano. Still hear the it's still there, but it's turned into energy. So we're in this place now. And then he ends the sonata, he's bringing this like pearls of light. And Alfred Brendel puts it beautifully. He says, the silence at the end of this piece is not signifying the end of the piece. The whole piece is a preparation for this silence. And I'm aware I've gone just through highlights, highlights is the wrong word, but extracts from this sonata. So I would recommend you to take the time, sit down and listen to the whole sonata. When you have the experience at the end, and preferably if you can ever have go to a live performance of this, it's even more powerful. Now, so Beethoven made this huge journey and really tapping into new levels of consciousness and awareness. And of course, on the back of Beethoven, a whole new era musically opened up. We have the Romantic era, late Romanticism, moving into the 20th century. And Mr. Scriabin, here he is, Russian composer. Not very well known, has been a bit, I think, very underrated, I think. He was in fashion in the 60s, 70s, I think, because of his exuberance and working with color, and, he was quite a hippie composer at that time. But he's far from, his music is so, not that hippie is something bad, but the connotation with hippie would be, what's the substance? And the substance of his music is just so, it's just extraordinary what he does in the music. And after the break, I will play you 3 pieces by Scriabin. So in a way, what I would like to give you is a bit of a listening guide. Because it's actually quite, particularly his late work, it's not easily accessible because he's entering into very different realms musically. And Cyril Scott, an English composer and writer, has put it that the harmonic system, which is preeminently devic in character, and he says it is possible to obtain that sense of between the notes, which is essential to the portrayal of deva music, What I would like to say is Scriabin was very familiar with the secret doctrine. He's an explorer, an esoteric explorer into sound and music. And he had a clear mission to portray these processes and share this with the world, what he discovered through his journey in sound. And there is a strong sense of him opening the awareness of what we would call the devas, the creative builders, to the creative forces in nature and in sound. And he takes us through that process. And it's useful to follow Scriabin when we begin to listen to Scriabin, listen at the beginning of his journey. He's very influenced by Chopin. And I'll play the beginning of a piece again that he wrote. It's one of his very early pieces, an etude, opus 2. I'll just play the beginning for now. So you can hear it's a language, again, that we can orient ourselves. It's tonal. So in this music, he really refines the emotional expression, the kind of almost hypersensitive awareness of emotional sensations. And he also begins to be very interested in the relationship between color and sound. And then he moves his language into a very new place, and there are lots of stages, and I will keep it quite simple because we'll come to the end and to questions quite soon as well. But we'll play the poem Nocturne on both pieces later after the break. But to show you how he moves from this etude to a very different language, which is it's a version of, we call it music atonality. So that means your usual orientation of dominant tonic is not working in the same way. So he opens this poem Nocturne like this. Very different sound world. And what he does here at the beginning, so he doesn't do, yeah? He does, opening the curtain, oh, musically, oh, we are going somewhere else here. This is, in a way, opening the veil, a version of renting the veil in a very subtle way in our perception of music, entering into a different world of music and forces. And this is what Cyril Scott, I think, referred to in terms of him entering into the realm where there's a perception of the creative forces within ourselves and music. And it's strongly related to the etheric level as well, I think, what he does in the music, how he organizes the structures. And he uses a lot of new techniques. And I just would outline one, which is the mystic chord, which is very famous in Scriabin's work. And it's basically it's this sound. And there's an interesting comment on this. It's the mystic chord's properties in tonal geometry were intended to represent the same thing in spiritual terms: a conduit, a nexus, a go-between, a mediator. These harmonies act as a link between the human and the divine. So he's using this chord in this piece to mediate between different states. I'll give you one example. One is a chord like this. which has a degree of heaviness, you could say inertia. He even says it's avec une volupté dormante. There's something tamasic, you could say. And then he resolved this chord into the mystic chord. Yeah, so he moves between these two states. And would I like to encourage, when you listen to this music, to really tune in what you can hear between different notes. He's exploring, in a way, one of the things he does in this piece, explores the tones between the smallest steps in the scale. With an acoustic piano, you have many more resonances. You would hear more of the upper harmonics. We're slightly limited with an electronic sound. But when you hear it on an acoustic piano, you hear this resonance and the harmonics that are emerging from what you play. So you don't only hear the notes that I play, you hear other superstructures if you really listen into it. And it's beginning to explore the space in between. And the way I think of the mystic chord also as a spiritual function of the heart. It constantly mediates in the music between different states of consciousness. So it's a very good piece, and he wrote even about this and said, this is about the exploration of states between waking and dreaming, or different states of consciousness. And if you think about the exercise before you go to sleep, you try to stay alert and conscious before you go to sleep. It's a similar space that he's exploring musically. So, just one of the pictures from his performance is actually Prometheus, which is a fantastic piece. It's the poem of fire. And I recommend again to listen to this. It's a fantastic piece. It's very similar. The language is very similar to what we hear in this poem, Nocturne. And you can see the symbolism in this is extraordinary. It is beautiful. It was a front page or a poster for their concerts. And what I would like just to say as well, and acknowledge that he was very, very interested in the relationship with sound and color. I didn't have time to go into that. But he, in one of his big pieces, Poem of Fire and Poem de l'Extase, he also has a color organ. I think he would be very happy having all the technology that we have today to project colors. He also had synesthesia. That means he saw colors in response to particular tones, which some people have naturally. So I think I leave you with this. There's a few reading guides for people who are interested in reading a bit more. Most of them, actually, they're not too technically demanding musically in terms of the background to read. They're very readable, but they can give you further inroads to Scriabin's music. And I will play you 3 pieces by Scriabin after the break. Thank you. Thank you.